I'll go ahead and open the meeting since we have a couple people. So I think everybody here knows me. I'm Rima Abiakar. I'm a planner for the Tri-County Region Planning Commission. I've been here about 4 years now, and we've been working on this gray area study for about a year. And we're glad that we're able to host these meetings and to have some participation from different people around the region. We can plan all we want ourselves, but it'll be meaningless without any actual feedback from people who live around here and are part of public transit in some way. So hopefully this study, we hope that it will ultimately lead to higher equity in transit around the region. So that is the large goal behind what we're doing. And as we get more in depth, I will hand it over to the Lockmuir crew to continue on the presentation.
All right.
Rima. Good evening, everyone. And first of all, we'd like to thank you all for making time to join today's virtual meeting. As Rima mentioned, any study related to transit is vital to get input from the citizens involved in it. So that's one of the core purposes of today's meeting. So let me briefly go through the agenda of today's meeting. We will start with introducing ourselves. Rima already did her part, and I will do the same along with my co-workers in a moment. We are going to do a brief project overview and the timeline, what we have done to evaluate the transit demand in the gray area, and what service alternatives we have explored. And finally, we also reviewed some additional considerations, including funding, availability, and other aspects related to politics and everything else. And then we are also hoping to get some valuable feedback from you through today's meeting. Next slide, please. So now the introduction part. Let me introduce myself. My name is Sharif Ullah. I have been working in Central Illinois for almost 16 years now, and I specialize in transportation planning, transit planning, travel demand modeling, and traffic engineering. With me, I have Michael Grovek, who is the project manager for this project. So Michael, would you please go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you, Sharif. Yes, I'm Michael Grovek, and I've been, in fact, this summer will mark a 50-year anniversary since my first summer internship with the Chicago Transit Authority. Worked in transit planning as well as other fields of transportation engineering for some time. In fact, got my start with CTA in Chicago. And in recent years, Lockmuir has really been able to help a number of smaller and medium-sized cities with their transit needs. And we're certainly glad that we can be here in Peoria to assist Tri-County with this important undertaking. And then Katie?
Thank you. And I'm Katie Shackelford. Many of you may know me. I used to live and work in the Tri-County region. I am a professional transportation planner. I have almost 9 years of experience, and I've been working on this project not only as a planner, but as the engagement lead. And we're doing all we can to make sure that we're engaging folks who are unable to attend in person. We're really thankful for all of you who've joined us tonight and those who are not able to attend and are watching this recording later. We hope that you will still provide your feedback and share your insights with us as we move forward towards the completion of this project. So I'll hand it back to Sharif.
Thank you, Katie. So before we go to the main part of the presentation, let me start with some housekeeping issues. So we are requesting everyone to mute their microphones at this time. And as I said, your questions and comments are very valuable and vital for this project. So please submit your questions and comments in the chat box during the presentation. And at any point in time, if you have any difficulty hearing or seeing the content, please let us know right away. Next slide, please. So what are the purposes of today's meeting? So we have identified three major purposes. Number one, to review the recommended services for the gray area, which we have identified, and then to review the available funding options, and finally, and most importantly, to get your feedback. So let's do a little bit of overview of the gray area. So what is the gray area? So in this particular map, as you can see that the gray area is part of the urbanized area, which is beyond the green area identified in gray, obviously. And this particular area is unserved by the Greater Peoria Mass Transit District. It doesn't have any specific contract for fixed route or paratransit service, and it's not also eligible for complementary paratransit service. So within the gray area, approximately 87,000 people live. And as you can see that that's a huge amount of population within the urbanized area, almost 35% of the overall population of the urbanized area here. And they don't have enough transportation choices when it comes to transit. Next slide. So we started this project in spring of 2020, in April of 2020. And from there, now almost at the end of March of 2021, we have come a long way. We have completed several very important steps of this projects, including a comprehensive existing conditions analysis, identifying the mobility needs, what could be the possible mobility solutions, and also funding analysis. We also had a public meeting back in October of 2020. And today's public meeting, we are going to talk about what we have accomplished since October of 2020. And as per the project schedule, we hope to complete the project by the end of May of this year. Next slide, please. So what progress we have done since we last met back in October of 2020. So we have explored the possible transit alternatives within the gray area. We estimated the transit demand based on the methodology described in the Illinois statewide transit plan, which is the same method which is also followed in the Transit Cooperative Research Program identified formula. And we didn't stop right there. What we did is we went ahead and identified another estimation method established by the National Center for Transit Research. And we, based on all this estimation process, we identified that within the gray area, approximately 600 one-way trip demand is currently there. So we evaluated all these transit options, assuming this would be the approximate demand for transit service. So what could be the best option available for this? Next slide, please. So now to talk about the previous engagement, I'm handing over to Katie. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharif. So the reason we're going to talk about previous engagement today is just to remind you what we've heard from the public and also just introduce to you some of the things we've learned that have guided the process that led us to the recommendations we're making this afternoon. The first, this plan has a steering committee that's going to meet in total 3 times. They've met twice already. That steering committee does guide this process and helps us determine where and how we should focus our energies. So the steering committee guided us to a couple recommendations. Some priorities that they identified really kicking off this project were to explore opportunities to increase service funding, really focus in on the needs of seniors and transit-dependent populations, even though we have other needs in this area, including commuter demand, where people need to get to and from jobs. We were guided to focus on those mobility needs for seniors and those with disabilities. We also were asked to look at improving coordination and increasing information before we introduce a new solution. One of the things that was identified early on was there are a lot of services that are trying to address the need that's in the gray area. However, they're not coordinated and they're very complex and hard to follow. So for a person who has recently lost their ability to drive or never had the ability to drive, it can be very daunting to try and tackle that information. And so that was one of the tasks put before us. And then finally, it was to explore the opportunity of a public-private partnership. How can we bring others to the table who also could benefit from this and keep the burden off of the taxpayers? In addition to the stakeholder or the steering committee, we offered the opportunity for stakeholder interviews. So as part of this robust process, we did sit down with 11 different stakeholders. And of course, during the pandemic, we sat down virtually. We asked each of these individuals and their organizations about what their concerns are for addressing the needs of the gray area, how we could deal with their clients and address their needs best, and then also some of the challenges that they're facing day to day and what opportunities they see for collaboration or solutions. And so many of the stakeholders talked about their concerns about the service restrictions, either service restricted by geography or services restricted by time of day. There were also concerns about the affordability of some services for their clients, especially those on fixed incomes. They did speak, many of these agencies know and work with one another. And so there is opportunity for interagency coordination and improving the efficiencies of the system as it exists today. And then finally, there was a strong emphasis to improve the service provider communication, promotion, and marketing so that more people knew of the services that were available and who was eligible for them. We took this information and it guided us as we did our first public meeting. You may have been in attendance. We had 39 live participants in that public meeting, and we asked you, the public, to help us identify how to address the priority issues. We wanted to make sure the public's priorities were aligned with those of our steering committee and stakeholders, and indeed, we were happy to hear that they were. Again, the public reported priorities being mobility for the elderly and disabled, the limitations to service area access, and then access to work and social services was a new one that came up because many of the services that currently exist are tailored for certain needs, especially medical needs. So if you have something for fun or something, to visit a friend or to go shopping, that gets bumped down the priority list and is less likely to be eligible for transit that's currently offered. And then we talked about prioritizing the solutions. Our public feedback came in to improve the coordination with the agencies, increase the information that's shared with the public, and extend those service hours. We took that information to heart, knowing that information is a pretty low-hanging fruit and something that we could address during this study. We have worked to create matrices to help people who live in the gray area to understand the complex makeup of the different services that could be available to them and those that don't have any services at all. So on the right, you'll see there are 4 different types of services that attempt to serve parts of the gray area, either in part or in whole. You'll see no community is fully served in all 4 categories. So there are communities that have access to CityLink. Those are the fixed route buses, the traditional buses you see day to day. There's an additional City Lift, which is an ADA service that's available. And then there's a City Lift $6 urbanized service that does, on the Peoria side of the river, does accommodate many people who are trying to travel in and around the urbanized area, and there's just a special fee. And of course, We Care in the Tazewell County and Woodford areas is providing services to Germantown Hills and Morton. As you'll see on the list to the left, there are a number of communities that have absolutely no transit service available to them. Those include Creve Coeur, Market Heights, North Pekin, Washington, and we exclude the Sunnyland Plaza because we know there is a bus route for Greater Peoria Mass Transit that does serve Sunnyland Plaza, but it does not reach all the way into Washington. And then anyone located in the unincorporated areas of urbanized Tazewell and Woodford counties do not have access to transit. Now, this is a very complex problem, and we wanted to go a little bit deeper on the information, and we're going to make these resources available to Tri-County to distribute to anybody who is interested. We have created a ridership matrix that shows you using the different services where you can and cannot go. So this was one of the challenges we also identified, was just understanding the limitations of what services where services could travel based on funding restrictions was a pretty complex feat for many people to understand. And so we've created this matrix so that you can see based on where your origin is, so where you're starting from, and then where your destination is, can you get a ride to that location? And we've color coded it with the 4 services that are provided. And you'll see those communities that do not have service, they show up as white across the board. But for example, if we had a person traveling from East Peoria who wanted to travel to Pekin, their one option, as you can see in red, is to use the CityLink fixed route bus service. Another option you can see here, say I am traveling, I'm in Peoria Heights and I want to travel to Dunlap. Well, there is not fixed route service available, but you could use the CityLift $6 urbanized service to get a ride from Peoria Heights to Dunlap. And so this is how you would use this matrix, and we're going to provide that for anybody who needs that extra level of information to help navigate this complex system. In addition, and we'll be getting into this in just a moment, we provided a survey once we met with many members of the public, and we had evaluated with our steering committee the transit options that we thought were a good fit for the community. We wanted the members of the public to help us determine which is the best fit, what riders would actually like to use. And so this survey was made available, focused on people who live in the gray area. We did receive 39 responses, and most of those respondents are actually people ages 55 and older, which is a great opportunity for us. That was our target audience, and that was the folks we were trying to get their feedback from on if they would use a service of this type. Overwhelmingly, we saw that people wanted that microtransit solution that you'll learn more about in just a moment. None of the residents, or none of the respondents that took the survey currently use transit, which makes sense. It's not readily available in the locations that they live. They mentioned that the reliability of a microtransit service would encourage them to potentially ride more instead of driving independently. And many, over 80%, didn't mind walking up to 5 minutes to access a ride. So this means a difference between door-to-door service and then finding a location that might be a gathering place for multiple people so that rides can be pooled together. And in addition to this, the respondents noted that they were comfortable paying $5 to $10 for a ride. This is actually more than what was calculated in our demand offering, where we looked at $3 to $6 rides. So this was really in a great location of affordability and feasibility for the study. The other thing that I'll mention is the range of comfort for paying for this. It went from $0 to $30. So there's a broad range of availability. Some of the things that may be challenges to overcome was the desire to pay with cash. There was a strong desire to pay for these services with cash, which would be a little more complicated, especially considering all the moving pieces and parts. So as we move forward with the recommendations and you learn more about it, remember that these are the information from the public that guided our decision making. And if you are interested in learning more or you have questions about the public feedback, you're welcome to submit those in the chat box now. It's a good time for us to take a break and just see if there's any questions out there. So unfortunately, I cannot see the chat box with my screen share. Are there any questions in the chat box at the moment, Rima?
No, I don't see any.
All right. Well, with that, we'll move on to service recommendations, and I will hand it off to Michael. Michael, you might be on mute.
You're right, but I'll start again. Thanks so much, Katie. And next slide, please. We initially evaluated 4 types of service. I'll describe each of them briefly. We have some details about some of these in the next few slides. Point deviation demand response, that's kind of a hybrid. It uses a relatively larger vehicle, such as the one pictured here, but it doesn't operate on a single fixed route. There are a few points along the route where the bus will be at scheduled times, but in between those scheduled times, it can deviate off route, a certain distance, either based upon request to the driver or prior contact to the dispatcher. The second type is demand response, and that is, think about dial a ride, the city, the city lift, ADA service, functions this way. And that is by reservation. You travel from point where you are and where you want to go. And then, of course, in scheduling those trips, typically also schedule the return trip as well. Microtransit is something fairly new. It uses smaller vehicles. In fact, I'll add that our assumptions in analyzing demand response, we'll get to that later, also use smaller vehicles than this. But this makes use of heavy use of smartphone technology and basically allows you to reserve a trip with less advanced booking requirements than demand response type of service. And it gives you also immediate feedback as to, you request when you'd like to travel and how soon you might expect the vehicle to be able to do that. A fourth one I'll mention briefly, fixed route commuter, which is for this study is a fixed route from a couple of the outlying communities into Peoria. So if you just go to the next slide, please, Katie. We'll actually go to this one I mentioned last, and simply to say this, that IDOT, that's the Illinois Department of Transportation, recently conducted a statewide transit plan, and they looked in fair detail at transit systems around Illinois. It recommended 2 commuter routes, which we're incorporating into our recommendations. They're described here. One is a commuter route serving Washington that would just be a peak period express route into Peoria in the morning, out of Peoria in the afternoon. And then a commuter route to Morton, which would operate 2-way service all day. And all day would be basically morning peak hours to afternoon peak hours, would not include evenings or a wider span of service. So we're taking this as a given. We're incorporating the state's recommendations. If you go to the next slide, I want to begin to describe the other services in more detail. Now, what you see here is actually a minivan adapted to demand response use. As it says, it operates in point-to-point fashion. Key difference here, it requires reservations, but where feasible will accommodate trips on the same day, but it isn't always able to. And vehicles are dispatched to serve people with similar origins or destinations in order to make the best use of the driver and vehicle. And this smaller type of vehicle also has the advantage that it does not require someone to have a CDL commercial driver's license, be operated with a regular operator license, which is, and Sharif may get into this later, represents a cost saving. Next slide. Now, microtransit, on the other hand, as it says here, dynamically generated routes, it requires a significant upfront investment in equipment and technology. Public or private agencies can provide such service. Think of it, it has many similarities to Uber and that sort of service. It says it provides transit-like service, but on a smaller and flexible scale. Typically, riders are expected to have a smartphone to reserve and access this service. Next slide. And here we have, just maybe to make the main differentiators here, to restate it again, that the point deviation service we looked at would require larger vehicles. The demand response, our assumptions here as well as the excuse me, microtransit is uses the smaller vehicles. You would arrange to use either the point deviation or even the demand response service, typically landline telephone using a dispatcher, whereas the microtransit makes use of smartphone technology. Next slide. Now, we undertook a pretty, I'll say rigorous assessment. I'm not going to go through all 8 of the criteria here. Understand that the lower score is the better score. 1 means you're performing best. And you'll note on all of these different categories that the demand response rated highest or tied for highest in 5 of the categories, microtransit in 4 of the categories, whereas point deviation demand response rated highest only in 1 of them and rated lowest in 5. So this basically led us to, considering all these factors, including public input, to focus our recommendations on demand response and microtransit. And finally, the next slide. For the services we're recommending, just to highlight the pros and cons, microtransit is more flexible. You can decide to make a trip in an hour or 2 and have a reasonable expectation being able to provide it. That's what it means by more responsive. And we found from our survey, it's more likely to attract new riders. That for someone who hasn't tried transit before, this is an attractive option. Cons, the higher startup costs in terms of technology and equipment is significant. It is technology dependent and also requires promotion and marketing. People would understand, pick up the phone, reserve a ride, but something which makes use of the smartphone technology is something new. With demand response, it's something already available. Many people are familiar with it, less administrative costs, but it is less flexible. As I said, typically requests customers to reserve their ride a day in advance. Same day service is accommodated where possible, and that's less responsive. And just one point about the smartphone technology here, I just maybe would like to add. Our firm does transportation planning, highways, transit, all kinds of transit modes. And we're finding more and more among a very wide variety of groups, including some you don't think of as maybe being key markets for this. Smartphone technology is really penetrating very well. For example, we're working on a major highway study in Indiana, and for the environmental justice, outreach to low-income minority communities, we had Federal Highway directly from headquarters tell us, look, under current pandemic conditions, we can't meet with people in person. Make sure you use smartphone technology because that has really good penetration in, some communities that are otherwise hard to reach. And similarly, about 3 years ago, we did an onboard survey attempted to survey all the riders on the Indianapolis system for their origin, destination, and trip patterns. And even though the average household income of a Indianapolis Indigo user is $25,000, the median household income is $25,000. Something about like 5 and 6 have a smartphone. So smartphone technology, things are trending that way. And that's what gives, the microtransit, a great deal of promise. So with that, Sharif will talk about funding.
Actually, I'm going to jump in here at the funding, but thank you, Michael. So when we looked at, as you can think back now, we presented you with the transit solutions we think are the best fit for the gray area. And the next question was, how do we pay for them? There's a lot of factors that we went in to consider which funding for transit operations might be the best solution. One thing we want to differentiate here, what we looked at was specifically operations funding. That's the day-to-day activities of making the system work. We did not explore capital, which is the startup costs that we mentioned, especially with microtransit, that can be a barrier to getting this sort of transit in your system. But some of the things that we considered when we were evaluating funding was timing. How soon could this funding become available? How much work would it take to get that funding? We looked at political feasibility. Is this something that's politically feasible in the community? Is it going to require a lot of discussion and debate? Is it going to take legal action? Is it going to have to take operations at the state or local level? We looked at the revenue sources. So we explored what money was already out there. And if you see in the next bullet, we looked at new versus reallocated funds. One of the things that we wanted to explore was, are there efficiencies in the system we could find that could serve this, that could fund transit operations without having to generate more money from the public or from a private agency? And so we looked at how we could, what were the best solutions to debate, either should we develop new fund solutions or reallocate the funds that are already available. And then we wanted to look at an administrative capacity. When it comes to more and more complex funding solutions, someone is typically responsible for managing the finances, and especially if it's something that requires a lot of finessing. Say, for instance, a mutual agreement between a number of communities. There has to be one agency that steps up and takes charge and says, I'm going to coordinate this paperwork and the money so that it's distributed in an equitable way. So that's the kind of thing we look at when it has administrative capacity. Is there an agency willing to step up and take charge and handle the finance and operations of this service? So as we look next, we started by evaluating how much it would cost to provide the services that we recommended. And you'll see there are 3 tabs in the table on the right. There's high, medium, and low. Obviously, high would be our ideal situation where we could serve 100% of the demand. That circle that Sharif mentioned earlier that shows 600 rides a day. If we were able to fund the service at high demand, we would serve all 600 of those rides. Medium demand would be 60% of those who need a ride would have an opportunity to have one, and then low demand is 30%. You'll see that the prices range from nearly 2.4 million all the way down to 670,000. Some things you'll notice: demand response and microtransit as operating facilities, as operating systems, are very, very similar in cost. And this is why we bring up again, microtransit has a very high upfront cost as compared to demand response. And so even though they both function similarly, microtransit would take more time to start just because of the needs to get it launched off the ground. So we looked at 3 different buckets, really. We looked at short term, which is the immediate. We looked at medium range, which is between 1 and 5 years. And then we looked at long range, things that could fund over time. So when we evaluated these immediate funding solutions, we looked at what money was already available and how it could be reallocated. So the primary recommendation we're making for short term is that to reevaluate how the 5307 funds are used in the Greater Peoria Mass Transit District's account to serve the entire urbanized area. So 5307 is a federal fund. It's one of those funds that is used. It's a formula fund distributed directly from the federal government. It is meant to serve the entire urbanized area. At this time, those funds are used to serve the services that Greater Peoria Mass Transit currently provides inside the urbanized area, but that does not that's currently not serving those that are located in the gray area. So we took 2 opportunities to explore how that could be reallocated. We applied this, if we used 5307 and we applied it equitably by geography, we would note that 60% of the urbanized area is located in the gray area. And in that case, the proportion of that fund that could be allocated for gray area services is nearly $1.2 million. That would help us meet the medium demand, and that would be a pretty instant solution. The second alternative is to apply the 5307 funds by population. And so 34% of the urbanized area's population lives in the gray area, and that applied to the funding could help us achieve nearly about $680,000 worth of services. So that would help us serve the low demand. And so these are our short-term solutions we recommend. The mid-range solution would take a little bit more time and coordination between different agencies. And this comes from a state level funding source. So the state of Illinois has what's called Downstate Operating Assistance Funds, and it's shorthand, it's known as DOPE. We are recommending that the DOPE funds that are used in Tazewell and Woodford County be reallocated from the DOPE is, let me step back a second. DOPE is only used in rural areas. So the downstate operating assistance funds are only used in this situation to serve the rural areas of Tazewell County and Woodford County. Each of those counties has an allocation. So they have a certain amount of money they are allowed to spend annually. In the case of Tazewell County, they are allocated nearly $1 million. However, over time, we've noticed that approximately $600,000 of that account is not realized annually. So that means that $600,000 might be available from the state of Illinois and could be reallocated to different needs. Similarly, Woodford County has over a $400,000 allocation, and $184,000 of that is unrealized annually. So if we were to combine the unrealized amounts and shift those to the urbanized area, they could cover the low demand need for the gray area services. Something like this solution would require that all agencies who are either recipients or the future recipient of the DOPE fund would have to sign on. So all agencies that would be affected by this would need to be in agreement that this is a solution. So that's why we put it in the mid-range, because there is some time of coordination and coalition building around this initiative. And that's why we considered this a mid-range solution. And then we look at some long-term solutions. So when we look at long-term solutions, we're thinking of things that would take more than 5 years to accomplish. This is where we thought about generating new revenue. In the long term, there are some opportunities to generate new revenue in the Tri-County region to provide funding for these services. We have listed 2 potential options here on the screen, and both, depending on how they are situated, could cover the entire high demand for the gray area. So these are 2 options. The Regional Transportation Authority has been recommended twice now in 2 previous long-range transportation plans that were drafted by Tri-County Regional Planning. A Regional Transportation Authority would be a new agency that would be at the highest level, actually probably ranging over the MPO, that would coordinate all the agencies that provide transportation services within a designated area. So that Regional Transportation Authority would need to be something that would take legislative action at the state level in order to exist. That's why we put it in the 5-year term, the 5-year bucket, because as far as getting state legislation through, we know that takes time and coordination and also political will. So this is a long-term action. Another solution that we presented here, you'll see, is a ballot measure. One of the benefits of a ballot measure is it provides dedicated funding for the item that is on the ballot measure. Again, this is something that would take political will. It would take some administrative support to get it on the ballot. There would be a lot of debates and opportunities for people to provide feedback and quite a bit of justification for why the funding might be needed. Service like this, broken down at the individual level, for a ballot measure of this sort would end up costing the general person in the community around $9 in taxes annually. And so that's something that we know is possibly a difficult pill to swallow, especially given the current fiscal climate. So we know that ballot measures and a regional transportation authority would be effective long-term solutions, but they would be a heavy lift as compared to some of the other reallocation funding methods. So at this point in time, we're going to turn it over to you. We have some time available to answer your questions and then see if you have anything you want to discuss in more detail.
So it might be too late for this, but I did receive an email from somebody who couldn't make it and is asking for a phone number. Do we have that available for this Zoom? It might be too late to join so that I could tell them to.
If I could.
Yeah, there is a phone number in that email invitation. So.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't sure which one. Sorry.
No problem. And we did have a number of people attend our lunchtime meeting. We do know that we appreciate your time, Doug, joining us today. So a couple of the questions we had earlier today that our panelists could probably revisit is we had some questions about where does 5307 come from? What does it mean? And how is it currently used? Did anybody want to tackle that one?
I think Michael provided a good definition of 5307 funding, and also Rima provided some good feedback.
Yeah, just to repeat what I said, 5307 funding is provided to urbanized areas across the United States. It's a formula, so it's not something you apply for or negotiate for. You just, learn every year. It's published in appropriate federal source what the allocation is for your urbanized area. And just to say, without going into a lot of the details, it can be used for either capital or operating expenses. And something else related to that, which came up, there is rural funding, which is designated as Section 5311. And let me just add that these sections, it's kind of shorthand in the transportation and planning world. It refers to a particular section of the federal legislation that authorizes these funds. So that just refers to the section of the legislation. Section 5311 refers to funding provided for rural, non-urbanized areas. And actually, just historically, this was provided as a way of providing some funding outside of urbanized areas where, initially, because in fact, going back to about 1987, the first agency which dealt with funding transit was called UMTA, the Urban Mass Transit either Transit or Transportation Authority, and it was actually part of Housing and Urban Development. I don't believe there was a transportation department at the time. So the initial emphasis for funding of transit was very predominantly urban, and then in time, U.S. DOT, Department of Transportation, came into being. Transit became focused on the entire country, and then you began to have funding also for rural transit as well. But anyway, so that's a little bit of interesting transit history, I think, but and I was there for it, so.
Great. Well, seeing no questions, I'm going to go ahead back to our presentation and let Sharif go over our next steps.
Yeah, as we mentioned during at the beginning of the presentation, when we were discussing the schedule, that we are almost at the end of this project, and it has been a good journey. I would say that we were able to analyze a lot of data for the gray area. We were able to also evaluate some viable transit options, looking at the funding opportunities. And the question is, what next? So what we are planning from now to almost at the end of May, that we are going to have another steering committee meeting, hopefully within the next month or so. There we are going to submit our draft plan for their review. And after that, it will be available to public for their comment, and that will be a 30-day period. And after addressing the steering committee's comments and also the public comment, we will submit the final plan to our client, which is the Tri-County Regional Planning Commission. And we should also mention that this particular project was possible because of IDOT's a funding opportunity, and a Tri-County, they had to apply for it. So I would like to thank Tri-County Planning Commission for working on that, and also to IDOT. So that these are the next steps we have ahead of us. As Katie mentioned, we still have some time to discuss any possible questions. So we are open to that.
Just anecdotally, I will add that when I was a staff member at Tri-County all the way back in 2013 and 14, this gray area concern had just recently been identified, and there was just a lot of confusion about how it should be solved and all the different ways that the need could be met. And so I really appreciated the opportunity to get to work on this project and see it from kind of concept all the way to completion, and hopefully that the leaders and the folks in Tri-County Regional Planning Commission and others see the value in this study and the potential that it may serve and improve equity for members throughout the region. We have identified quite a few features that just the gray area is made up of a lot of wonderful people, but those people are aging in place. And in order for them to have the opportunity to age in place and to thrive, they need the ability to move and visit friends and family, go shopping, see their doctors as needed. And this is a solution that can really help them achieve that. So we hope that you've enjoyed this presentation, that you found it informative, and that you want to share the good word with your family and friends and talk about how this could really serve your community in the future.
Yeah, thank you, Katie.
Yes.
Well, hearing no questions, maybe we will call it a night. The recording will be made available on Tri-County's website. So anybody who wasn't able to attend today will still have an opportunity to view and hear about our discussion.
Yeah, with this, we'd like to thank everyone who joined today, and we have a good amount of people who also joined during our afternoon presentation. So thank you, everyone. We highly value your participation and also all the comments we have received. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.